Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sacker. Draw up a list of the biggest bands in the history of rock and roll, and a remarkable number of them will be British. There's the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, of course, but also Pink Floyd, whose albums The Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall remain rock classics. Well, my guest today is Roger Waters, who was a dominant figure in the band until he quit in 1985. He is still performing, and he remains the most controversial of rock stars. So what motivates him? Roger Waters, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
It's more than 30 years since you wrote The Wall. You're still touring with it. It was born out of pain and anger. I wonder if you still feel the pain and the anger.
The feelings involved, I mean, feelings come up from time to time as one goes through life, obviously, but my feelings at 70 are different than my feelings were at 30-odd.
Does that make it harder to actually put the show together and do it with feeling?
No. What happened was there was a very long hiatus between the shows that happened in 79, 80 and 81 and when we started touring again, which was in September 2010. So I started to work on a new production sort of in October, November 2009. And when I started, in my mind, I thought I can only really do this if I reinvent the show to suit who I am now. I.e., the show back in 1979 was very much the product, as you say, of an angry, almost but not quite middle-aged man, you know, who'd been through problems with relationships and women. But there is some political content. But I was determined now to focus much more on the politics and much less on the personal narrative, which is what we did. And we spent many months, nearly 10 months, preparing all the visuals and the way the show would work.
And I want to talk about the politics and the way you as an artist weave the politics into the show in a minute. But for those people watching who maybe, you know, some don't know the Roger Waters story, I just want to stick with the personal for a second longer, because The Wall is almost like a form of memoir. So much of it seems to be, in essence, about the terrible loss you suffered as a baby. Your father was lost in the war. You never really knew him. Also, you hated your school and your educational experience. And I just wonder, even though maybe the pain has gone, whether those experiences shape you.
Well, my father, clearly, you know, I'm so grateful that I carry my father's genes. My father was a wonderful man. He died very young. He was only 30 years old when he died at Anzio in Italy, fighting the Nazis. But he was an extremely interesting man who died absolutely for his principles. He was a conscientious objector at the beginning of the Second World War. And then he worked as an ambulance driver through the Blitz. And he then started doing voluntary work on bomb sites, where he met my mother. And together they became interested in politics. They probably both joined the Communist Party. Either before or around that time. And he eventually decided that his communism and the need to fight fascism trumped his Christianity. And so, devout though he was, he went back to the conscription board and said, "Excuse me, I've changed my mind, I want to go and fight." And they said, "I say, jolly good, you've got a degree and everything. Officer material, put this chap down as..." And so he did basic training and then officer training, commissioned, boom, and killed.
I mean, what intrigues me is that you have such passion for him. You never knew him, but in a way, the fact of not knowing him maybe has intensified your desire to do something with your life that you believe he would have been proud of.
Well, you're absolutely right. On a gig somewhere in America, we have vets who come at half-time to every show. But at one gig, there was this chap standing there, and he was out of the main circle of people wanting pictures and autographs. And when I went to leave, he stopped me, and he put his hand out, so I took his hand, and I went, I'm glad you could come, you know, and whatever. And I went to go back to the stage to do the second act. He wouldn't let go of my hand, and I stopped. And he looked me in the eyes, and it's hard for me to tell you this story, and he said, your father would be proud of you, to me.
And that meant a lot.
Oh. It wasn't that him saying it meant it, it's just, I cannot not be moved, even aged 70, by what my father might have thought of what I do, because in retrospect I admired him so much, and my mother, I have to say.
Well, let's then, I mean, that's a very powerful personal motivation, which I can see. Let's now talk about politics. Your dad was political. You mentioned he was a member of the Communist Party for a while. You have become associated with very strong political opinion. The Wall, the show you're still doing, is loaded with political imagery and, you could say, political comment.
You could. It is. You are correct.
And perhaps the strongest reaction you've got is from people who see some of the imagery, and in particular the imagery on that inflatable pig, which is a central part of the show.
Here we go.
See it as anti-Israeli, and some say anti-Semitic.
Well, this has become an old chestnut now, because this whole question of this particular pig, which appears in the second half of the show, where I am playing the part of a fascist demagogue, or any kind of an extremist demagogue, if you like, is satire. And it's recognized as being that. This record has been out there with the lyrics that are contained in the work, which are part of the narrative, for, as you say, since 1979. So the use of different symbols on the pig, which include the Star of David, the crucifix, the crescent and star, the dollar sign, the hammer and sickle, and all kinds of other symbols that I felt were relevant when we were designing the show, have been there on, as part of the show since 2010. I had the accusation of being anti-Semitic levelled at me by the ADL, which is the Anti-Defamation League, which is an organisation in the United States of America, by a man called Abraham Foxman, who is the president of this organisation, which purports to be set up to protect Judaism and the Jewish faith and the Jewish people from defamation. Hang on, let me just finish the attack, because this is very important. So I wrote back to him back in 2010 when this whole thing started, and they sent people to see the show, and they made the decision that this was satire and it was not anti-Semitism.
I don't want to spend too long on this, but
neither
just
do I, because the show's not about that.
Exactly.
The show is about my desire to break down the walls between peoples, between ethnicities, religions, nationalities, and so on and so forth.
Understood.
That's
so a couple of brief questions, if I may, then we'll definitely move on, because there's a lot more I want to talk about. Just simple questions. The fact that some Jewish people who have seen the show have been upset by it, have found it offensive, has that at any point ever given you pause and ever perhaps prompted you to think about whether you were going to change the way you present the show? Of
course. I think about it every day. Of course it does. Of course. You can't dismiss people's feelings. It's with me the whole time.
But you haven't changed it.
No, because it's like, how could I put it? You cannot join the ostrich society. Let's bury our heads in the sand, pretend that these problems don't exist in the Middle East and have nothing to do. As Elie Wiesel, the American writer who wrote Night, he famously said, and I think it was a wonderful and great thing for him to say, and I agree with him wholeheartedly, he said, the greatest sin of all is to stand by silent and indifferent. And I would suggest that that should be true of any act of oppression or of any predicament that human beings find themselves in anywhere in the world, irrespective of their religion or their race or their nationality.
Okay, if we may leave politics
Let's
there,
do it.
because there's a lot I want to talk about connected with the music and Pink Floyd and your solo career. And I want to go back to the beginning in a way. And I'm interested, you just said something, you know, you said, I don't believe I'm always right. And I want to go back to the creative beginnings of Pink Floyd, when you and a bunch of friends, fellow students, got together in the mid-60s and founded the band, Pink Floyd. When you look back on those early years now, and the way that you related to the other members of the band, and we'll talk about them, do you think you got some things wrong in the way you handled relationships and the band?
Well, I don't think you're talking about the early years, because the very early years were like 64, 65, 66. Then we turned pro in 67.
And then there was the crucial moment when Sid Barrett, your friend,
Sid got ill, yeah.
And he left the band in 68.
Yes, that's
and
true.
That was the first big
and Dave
difficulty.
joined the band, yeah, and it was very difficult after that, because Sid was absolutely the core of everything when Pink Floyd first started its professional career, because he wrote 90% of the songs. I think I wrote one song on the first album, maybe two, but basically, you know, it was in his hands until he
You've
got
described him as the visionary, but
Yeah.
was it drugs that destroyed Sid Barrett as a member of Pink Floyd? And if it was, how close did drugs come in that era of acid and psychedelia to actually destroying the band?
Well, my personal belief is that drugs, you know, LSD was not solely responsible for Sid's illness. It felt to me at the time that Sid was kind of drifting off the rails, and when you're drifting off the rails, the worst thing you can do is start messing around with hallucinogenics. There is no question but that LSD, and he did take quite a lot of it, I believe. I wasn't living with him at the time.
But I just wonder whether you, David Gilmour and others were on the same path at the time. Not at all.
Nothing, no, not even. I took LSD once in my life, and it was amazing, but I thought, wow, I don't want to do that again. Not because it was horrific, but just because that's a choice you make. You either go down that path or you don't. But it definitely exacerbated the symptoms that, loosely strung together, you and I might call schizophrenia. He heard voices, he became incommunicative, he turned into a different person. They were black holes in the sky, you know. It was.
I mean, the remarkable thing is that it clearly affected you and the band deeply, but after his departure, you know, you created music that will live as long as rock and roll lives. I mean, Dark Side of the Moon still is one of the most popular albums to download in the world. And another interesting thing you've said about that is that was, in essence, the moment when you felt the band had achieved what it was set out to achieve, what you all set out to achieve. And from then on, you said, we clung together more out of fear than hope.
Right. Well, that's my opinion.
So was it all a downward slide from Dark Side of the Moon?
Well, no, of course not. Because if you look at what we did together, uncomfortable as it was to be in that relationship where we were no longer four guys in a garage, but basically we were a real group, four guys driven by the ambition of making it. With Dark Side of the Moon we made it, and those ambitions ceased to be quite as important as they were. And so the cracks which led to the eventual schism in 1983 or whenever it was, were there all through the making of Wish You Were Here and Animals. And the war, and certainly the final.
I mean, that is very honest, but it's leaving me thinking, what kind of life can it have been for more than a decade creating with these guys, living side by side with them, and let's be honest, particularly maybe David Gilmour more than anybody, living side by side, working together, and actually rubbing each other up the wrong way, having a deteriorating relationship, and, excuse my language, pissing each other off. I mean, it must have been a very weird life.
Well, we didn't live side by side. You know, outside of working hours, we never saw each other.
Really?
No.
Because what, you couldn't stand the sight of each other after a while?
No, we could stand the sight of each other because, you know, in fact, as became increasingly clear as the years went by, we didn't have all that much in common. But we did work well together. I mean, the work that we did together through, in spite of the fact, you know, that we were not blood brothers, was remarkable. And,
well,
we both made great contributions to it, as did Rick and as did Nick.
With respect, over years since, you have talked about the fact that, you know, you felt the songwriting, frankly, was more and more being yours, you know, that you felt they weren't contributing very much. And there was, I think, toward the end...
It wasn't something I felt. Those are the facts.
Right, and toward the end, I mean, David Gilmour said that at certain sessions and recording moments, he felt almost there wasn't any point turning up because you were so controlling.
You are such a stirrer. I'm not going there. That's it. I'm not going any further. We had a great career together. It was fantastic. I look back upon it with huge pride, or, you know, but with a great feeling that, wow, that, and almost of surprise that we managed somehow to create this great work. And I'm not going to apportion plaudits or blame to anybody.
Sorry to interrupt, because this is so interesting for so many people around the world who know the band and know the story of the band and all the rancor that came out in '85 when you walked away, and then there was, I think, 2 years of legal battles because you didn't want the Pink Floyd name and the Pink Floyd act to continue. You felt that was wrong, given that you'd walked away from the band.
I did. I did think that was wrong, and I was wrong.
Were you?
Of course I was. Who cares? It was a commercial decision. You know, and in fact, it's one of the few times that the legal profession has taught me something. Because when I went to these chaps and said, listen, this isn't Pink Floyd anymore. They went, well, what do you mean? That's irrelevant. It is a label and it has commercial value. You can't say it can cease to exist. You obviously haven't looked back to Runnymede, and you obviously don't understand English jurisprudence. You know, it's not about what you think it's about, it's what it is. Which brings me to, sorry to go on, but the law is everything that we have. That's what the wall is about. The wall is about the law. The wall is about 1789, the wall is about 1776, the wall is about 1948, the wall is about human rights. And it's about our declaration.
I got you.
Sorry.
But I'll tell you what, the wall's also about you. And I suppose what I'm still fishing for is an explanation or some sort of description of how and why you really changed after the rancor of the mid-'80s. Because I'll just read you something you said about that period. You said, I was frightened, defensive, embarrassed, sexually insecure, and that's why I was snotty and aggressive. Well, that was the old you. And, you know, in the years that came after, you found a way back to relationships with the members of the band, and in 2005, you even played that famous gig together for Live 8 where Pink Floyd came together again. So what happened?
Well, where to start? Obviously, after our schism, and when Dave and Nick and Rick went off and played all over the world, and I was sort of stooging around with my different bands that I put together, and I made a couple of solo albums and toured them, it was very, very difficult. Because nobody had any idea who I was, and they weren't really interested.
Well, they certainly knew who you were, but
they didn't.
They weren't. The critics at the time weren't really liking your solo material.
Well, that may well be true as well, but the fact is that Joe Public would respond to anything, you know, that was called Pink Floyd, in a way that they would never respond to anything that wasn't. And you know, people might say...
How frustrating was that for you?
It was very character forming, you know. Well, there's a famous occasion when I was in Cincinnati and I was playing in like a 3,000 or 4,000 capacity arena to about 1,000 people. And the very next day, the chaps were playing to a sold-out show of 70,000 people in the Colts football stadium.
You mean the chaps being Pink Floyd?
Yeah, and I remember at the time...
God, that must have hurt.
No, I remember at the time standing on stage and thinking to myself, you know what? This is character forming. This is not the worst thing in the world. Who was it? It was It was Jung who was always saying, I'm really worried about so-and-so, he's just suffered a great success, I think. Well, I'm not saying that Jung has got the answer to everything, but nevertheless, he was a wise old bird in some ways. And so I don't think there's anything, wrong with a little bit of humbling.
And again, you talked about being wrong in terms of the lawsuits against the band in the mid-80s. Looking back, do you think there is some truth in the caricature of you as being a control freak, domineering, and just trying too much, too often to drive the band exactly where you wanted it to go?
Yes. Yes and no. I may have been domineering, but you either have ideas or you don't. And if you do have ideas, you can't be expected to sit on them like that. Just because somebody else isn't having ideas. So that's why it was the correct thing for us to split up, or for me to leave, if you like, so that I could express my ideas unfettered. And my ideas are still, I've had a few breakthroughs recently, which I won't talk about, but I am going to make another record. I've had a very, very strong idea, and I shall pursue it. I will make at least one more record, and I'm really looking forward to getting my teeth stuck into it. But I couldn't be doing that if I had somebody looking over my shoulder going, oh, I don't think that's very good. Well, do something yourself then. Well, I might need a few years before I actually write a song.
Then how frustrating has it been, and maybe still is, that the rock industry is so obsessed with reunions and reworking the past that I dare say pretty much every week since you walked out of Pink Floyd, and despite the mini reunion over Live Aid, you still constantly get asked.
No, I don't. People have finally realised that they're flogging a dead horse.
Do you think they really have?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I tell you why, because people very, very rarely bring it up with me at all. And
is there no part of you which looks at, Jagger and the Stones, looks at David Bowie, looks at all these...
Well, Bowie hasn't toured for years and years and years, but anyway.
Well, he's released an album which is now getting huge plaudits. And I just wonder whether you sometimes look at that and you think, you know what, Pink Floyd could still produce new music.
Yeah, it's so weird that you should be asking me this question, because normally you're really intelligent and you ask proper questions, about proper things. Yeah. Why would the reasons for me leaving in 1985 not pertain now? How long? About 30 years later?
Because you've changed.
But the situation hasn't changed, and I haven't changed at all. And you're exactly right when you say that I like to be in charge of my own destiny, and I like to pursue though, having said that, I like to work with other people who are creative. It's one of the great pleasures of being, it's not like being a painter,
A final question then, and this is about you as an artist and your motivation. I just wonder, do you have to believe that your best work is still to come, or is there a part of you that acknowledges that the work that will define you and maybe that you're proudest of happened a long time ago?
That's a good question. The third album that I made on my own, which was called Amused to Death, in my view, has never received the attention it deserves.
In your view, is that up there at the same level of artistic achievement as Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall?
Yes. And it surpasses Wish You Were Here or Animals or any of the other work that we did by quite a large margin. However, to answer the question, I am as excited about what I'm going to do when this tour's finished as I am about either of those works or Dark Side of the Moon.
We're going to have to end there, but Roger Waters, thank you very much.
Not at all.
For being on
Hardtalk.
Hardtalk.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it immensely. Thank you.